Okay, welcome back to a few rotten reviews. On this episode, I will do some rotten reviews on Highlander 2, The Quickening. Highlander was a box office flop, something that was completely ignored back in the day in 1986. Myself, I only have vague recollection of seeing it on the marquee at a theater near where I lived. I had zero interest in it. I hadn't heard of it. Most people my age had never heard of it during its theatrical release. It's not until it was released on video and subsequently released on HBO where people my age were exposed to it, and suddenly it took off. In fact, it took off so well, it spawned a franchise, it spawned a TV show that went on for 6 seasons, and it also spawned several bad attempts at continuations in the movie side of things. So I would consider this perhaps an overall review of Highlander the franchise, but I'm going to, after I recap Highlander the franchise, I'm going to attempt to just go over the rotten reviews on Highlander 2 The Quickening. The reason for that is that this movie is considered the downfall of what would have otherwise been quite a franchise. It rubbed fans the wrong way in an extreme fashion. I mean, literally as extremely bad. It rubbed them as though very similar to what's happened nowadays with Star Wars. Um, there was no internet back in the day. The internet was in its infancy during the release of Highlander 2 The Quickening. And so while it really angered the fans of Highlander, we didn't have anybody to complain to, at least not where we could just pull it up at home in our pajamas and spout it out to the world. So I'm going to try to cover some of that here. Now, the original film, it still has a tomato meter critic score of 69% and an audience score of 79%. And I'm surprised that these numbers are as high as they are, because as the entire franchise has faded into a type of dormancy, usually you get a further disconnect with people that are currently reviewing movies, and I would have expected these scores to go down. Back in the day, had Rotten Tomatoes been around in, say, 1988, 1989, when this Highlander franchise, when the interest in the fictional world of Highlander had reached its peak, I would say that these scores would be right up there in the 90%, 80% range, guaranteed. But still, I'm surprised this film, the original, has maintained its popularity for the age that we're talking about. Now, the original film was unique in that it featured a score which was a little bit musical, but a large part a rock score by mostly Queen. And that gave it an edgy feel for a film that came across as a science fantasy historical drama. It had an edgy rock feel to it. Now, half of the film took place in prior centuries, and half of it took place in modern day 1980s New York City. And that was something unique at the time. It was something that we hadn't seen before. It used a lot of flashbacks, but it was very well put together with those flashbacks, and the flashbacks worked fantastically to move the plot forward. It was quite a unique thing in its day, and it's still rather unique the way it's put together. So I'm going to quickly go through what happened after Highlander. Now, the next installment, the one we're going to actually be looking at more in depth, is Highlander 2 The Quickening. This one was released in 1991, and when fans heard it was coming, they were so enthused. They were completely hyped for this thing to show up. To them, and even to myself, Highlander had reached an almost mythological status, and we considered it, to have a living lore all its own. And this was before the internet was a thing. So Highlander 2 was a huge disappointment, and we'll get into that. And that was 1991. From there, it moved on to Highlander 3, The Sorcerer. Now, this is a little confusing, and it was confusing to the fans at the time because originally we saw it as Highlander 3 The Sorcerer, and then at some point it started showing up, particularly on home video and on cable, as Highlander The Final Dimension. And either way, it's considered one of the worst of the franchise, and it didn't anger the fans like Highlander 2 did, but it didn't improve anything either. So the other interesting thing about Highlander 3 is it completely disavowed Highlander 2, and this was like a reboot again of Highlander, because Highlander 2 was considered such a disaster. And now this Highlander 3, this was actually, you know, something that people looked forward to with promise, because they said, well, Highlander 2 was such a disaster that this will put it right again. Unfortunately, I found out quickly, about 10 minutes into the movie, that that wasn't going to be the case. Now, Highlander 3 had ended in a way that it didn't make it impossible to start over yet again with a fourth one. And sure enough, all the way forward in the future, in the year 2000, Highlander Endgame came out. Now, Highlander Endgame, while the fourth in the franchise, is technically also the final capstone of the Highlander TV show, in that most of it involves the character from the Highlander TV show, played by Adrian Paul. But it does, I don't know if you would call it a cameo, or a very small part of it does end the story of the original character Duncan MacLeod, that was the star of the first three movies. So it's basically, Highlander Endgame is basically the endgame for both the TV show side of Highlander and for the movie side of Highlander. It is probably the lowest regarded on Rotten Tomatoes, and that's a toss-up between this one and Highlander 2. I didn't think Highlander 3 was that bad because I was a fan of the TV show, and the TV show was not bad at all. The TV show, I would highly recommend, even to this day. It's definitely something you have to put your mind into, that you're back in the 90s. If you can get into that, then you can get into the show. I would highly recommend it. Now, we're going to be looking at Highlander 2, The Quickening, and the rotten reviews on that. These are the rotten reviews that are probably going to demonstrate just how badly the fans thought of this sequel, Highlander 2. It was almost like the middle finger to the fans. It took something that was originally about an immortal character who had grown up on Earth through the centuries and had to fight other immortals to claim this mythical prize. It turned from that into some kind of sci-fi reboot, in which they said that all of these immortals were born on a planet called Zeist, somewhere else in the galaxy, and had been transported to Earth. And it completely turned the Highlander premise on its head and rebooted it and put it in a fictional futuristic setting that was a sci-fi setting. We can get more into that. Let's start right off in the rotten reviews. 1 star, a disaster of a film, flimsy film that throws out the heavy metal album cover coolness of the first film's fantasy contest for a nonsensical sci-fi sequel rewrite. There is exactly one good scene involving Sean Connery and a Scottish tailor, and one stupidly entertaining scene where Michael Ironside's villain gets to drive the heck out of a subway train. Everything else is as entertaining as passing a gallstone. Okay, to put some background into this, Sean Connery was one of the major draws of the first Highlander movie. He appears in this second one, but he has almost no relevance to the story. In this one, the main character is now an old man. He's in the future. He has become some sort of scientist, and he has protected the Earth with some kind of electromagnetic shield that mitigates radiation, because in this future world, the ozone layer had completely dissolved. Society would have been doomed, but he saved them all with this magical space shield. It's completely nonsensical and disconnected from the first movie. Again, Sean Connery only has a small part in it and nothing affecting the plot. Um, let's just go on from there. Half a star, contradictions and plot nonsense. This would be a better movie without the Highlander title. And again, yeah, because it's not Highlander. In fact, the next movie completely disavows it. This director decided to turn this into some kind of sci-fi story, and it was like a big FU sci-fi story to the original fans. Um, this is unusual. A 5-star review. An excellent cast as well as dazzling sequences transcends Highlander 2's silliness and makes it one of the best action films of all time. Wow, this was written in April of 2019. It's hard to imagine who would have written this. I can't understand why it would be, you can't say it would be a bot or a company shill because this movie is not even a thing. Um, on the other hand, you can't believe that anybody would have this opinion of it. So I just don't know if I even believe what has been typed here other than it could be a complete troll. Half a star. If you are a fan of this series and run across this movie, buy it and burn it. Well, I would tend to agree, but before you burn it, like get drunk and watch it and try to figure out what the hell happened. Um, 5 stars. 4.1 on IMDb, 0% on Rotten Tomatoes, and 22% from the audience. Did people even watch the movie? Think for yourself. This was a damn good sequel. It's Highlander in the world of Frank Miller's Dark Knight Returns and Blade Runner with badass action. Our hero comes out the fire, reborn in an epic quickening. Cars are blown up, glass is shattered, a truck explodes, and from that moment on he's revamped and rejuvenated, has a few good fights with a charismatic villain. Wow, I have to think this is a troll. So to break this down, in the first Highlander movie, the centuries-old character defeats all his other immortal opponents, particularly the bad guy, the Kurgan, and after he defeats them all, his prize is to basically understand what the world leaders of the world are thinking and how he's going to somehow bring about world peace and change the world. That's not exactly defined at the end of the movie. But it's a fantasy. Now, in the second movie, all of a sudden, he's an old man, having lost his immortality after he defeated all the other immortals. He's an old man, and he is killed basically by a street criminal. And in the process, it somehow makes him immortal again. And he goes on to have this sci-fi story. Now, in the process of becoming an old man, it is shown that he became a scientist and fixed the world's ozone layer problem. It's a complete disjointed mess. I mean, it makes sense. It's explained well in the plot about how this happens, but it's disjointed. It doesn't fit with the original movie. It doesn't fit with Highlander. It doesn't explain how all of a sudden, in the first movie, he's defeated all the immortals, and now all of a sudden, he's back to being an immortal again. It's completely disjointed. Although it is explained, it's like explained right into a strange sci-fi world that has no bearing on the original. It's a complete disconnect. Half a star. Highlander, an action fantasy classic about two immortals who are the only ones capable of killing each other. It's a great movie that we are not talking about today. And I agree with that. The whole premise is still interesting. In its day, it was unique, and I think it could still be done today. There is so much possibility, and that was explored in the TV show, so that's why I recommend the TV show. If you want to explore the idea that there are these immortals hunting each other down, no matter what you think this prize is, the TV show explores that, and it goes into all the things that could come out of that. What are the complications of that? It's fantastic. But here, this movie just throws it all away and tries to turn it into some kind of cheap sci-fi story. But let's continue on with this review. It's a great movie that we are not talking about today. Today, I'm talking about the sequel that somehow managed to cast James Bond himself, Sean Connery, as one of the main characters, along with Michael Ironside, who just 1 year prior appeared in Paul Verhoeven's sci-fi action masterpiece Total Recall. With two actors who clearly have talent in one form or another, what could possibly go wrong? Well, here we bring up, Michael Ironside. He was a big actor in the '80s, even in TV shows, mostly sci-fi. He has a distinctive type of character he plays. He was in this Highlander sequel, and he brought the sci-fi element, I guess, because he had already made a name for himself in sci-fi shows and sci-fi movies, as we're referring to here, Total Recall. Now, bringing in anything from Total Recall to Highlander, it's just really bizarre. The fans took it the wrong way. The fans still take it the wrong way, and I have no good memories of what happened with Highlander 2. But Michael Ironside, yeah, I have nothing but praise for him. In the '80s, as a teenager, I enjoyed everything he was in, including Total Recall. But bringing him and sci-fi into Highlander, wow, what a disaster. 5 stars. Hey, these movies are worth watching at least once. Pick a bored rainy day, in a mood for a binge watch, get them in order, you won't regret it. Actually, you would not regret watching the first one. You might kind of passively watch the third one that disavows the second one, but when you hit the second one, it's going to be like throwing ice water at you, and you won't be expecting it. 2 stars. It gets 100% of a rating above B Panther: The Quickening. At least in that regard, it's better because anything's better than Wakandans. Oh, well, we're referring here to the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Um, I don't get the comparison at all. I wouldn't give Highlander 2 stars personally. I would give it 1 star. This reviewer is giving it 2, and they're saying that it's better than Marvel's Black Panther movie, which I disagree. While I don't think Marvel's Black Panther movie is anything, that's it's not Citizen Kane, it's not Infinity War, but to make excuses for Highlander 2 because it's not as bad as that. Wow, this guy really has his tastes all upside down here. Highlander 2 is far worse than Black Panther. In fact, I would say it's even worse than Captain Marvel because it completely subverts Highlander. It completely gives the middle finger to Highlander, and it's not like the last movie, so you can ignore it or not watch it. It's smack dab in the middle of all of them. So if you didn't know any better and you were coming into the Highlander franchise, like say somebody younger in their 20s now, and they hadn't ever seen anything of the Highlander, if they started just watching them chronologically, when they hit number 2, it's going to be the type of speed bump that just takes the suspension right out of their car. This isn't how you want to go about it. My advice is to skip Highlander 2. You'll be glad you did. Maybe watch it later after everything else just to see how screwed up it really is. But you hit Highlander 2 without warning, and again, it's like you're cruising along in a Lamborghini and you hit that speed bump you weren't expecting, and you end up right in the repair shop. So yeah, half a star. It's down there with Terminator 3 as one of the worst sequels, which suffers even more in the shadow of its great predecessor. Simply should have never happened. Sickens me to think of someone earning a good salary in a great industry and getting paid to churn out shit like this. I agree, except I agree with the half star. Okay, I would give it 1 star, but half a star is fine. I disagree with comparing it to Terminator 3 because Terminator 3 was just a mediocre replay of Terminator 2. It wasn't a middle finger to Terminator 2, and it wasn't such a speed bump that you just totally disavowed anything with the Terminator. That's what we're talking about here with Highlander 2. It's far worse than Terminator 3 or any of the other Terminator movies. 5 stars. This is the second best movie of all time. Only Cuffs, starring Christian Slater, is better. Okay, that's clearly satire. Christian Slater is a topic for another day, but yes, this was truly a 5-star satire post. 3.5 stars. On the Laserdisc cut with both climbing above the shield and fairy tale sequence. Director's cut makes no sense at all, and 2004 edit with new special effects is awful at all levels. Well, I disagree with the stars, because why did they put 3.5 stars when they basically told me it was crap? They do bring up a good point, though. I had completely forgotten to mention that there have been a couple of attempts to fix this movie. Um, None of them fix the main problem, which is the whole premise itself is an FU to Highlander. But different cuts of it have tried to fix things, hoping that somehow it can be re-released on video and make a few more dollars. Don't bother. You can't fix something that's fundamentally a rotten idea to begin with. So, half a star, rotten sequel, sorry unfinished sequel. I don't disagree with unfinished. It finished its story. It just was a rotten idea to begin with. The musical score was again by Queen. You can't fault that. It's a callback to the first one. I actually enjoyed the score and the music. It was a little more subdued and less edgy than the first movie. Unfinished? No, no. This was finished. It just, the entire premise of it was bad. Um, Continuing, I believe the director was fired before completion and the company went bankrupt. Not sure on that one. Probably due to Sean Connery's hefty wage. I doubt that because he was barely in it. The film is a mess from the confusing plot to the jumps from scenes. MacLeod changes swords and location during his final duel. All involved should be ashamed of themselves. There is a renegade cut, director's cut, that erases all the stupid Planet Zeist nonsense and attempts to fill in the holes in the original. Yeah, the Renegade Cut is what one of these attempts to fix it are called. It doesn't erase the sci-fi part of it, though. I mean, yes, it erases the opening scene that shows them on planet Zeist having a battle. But even taking that out, it's still a sci-fi film about a giant shield around the Earth and corporate evil villains, that have to be stopped. It doesn't fix that. The sci-fi element, not just the planet Zeist itself, but the sci-fi element itself is a big FU to Highlander. So no, like I said, don't bother with the attempted refix edits of this. 2 stars. Some say this is the worst of the worst. Not so. There are sequels that far surpass this. Sure, the antagonists are way too silly and the script makes significant changes to what the original film laid out. That's an understatement. Even the sci-fi edge is all wrong and really should have been omitted or worked in another way. Still, though the protagonists are likable and the music is acceptable, it's not a good story at all, but it's not the worst. For my full review, okay, it is the worst. It's not the worst movie in the history of movies, but it is the worst of the Highlander films. It is the worst, like, dropping a boulder on top of your car, the worst. Yeah. What has happened to Christopher Lambert? I don't know. I don't have the energy to look it up, but he pretty much faded out with the Highlander franchise. If Highlander 2 hadn't have bombed, perhaps he would have been in a TV show instead of Adrian Paul. I don't know. That's just speculation. But Christopher Lambert has vanished off the face of the Hollywood world, so to speak. Half a star. Ignores pretty much everything from the first one. It makes no sense and is beyond painful to watch. Okay, that's coming from a fan. The second one, just right off the bat, when you realized Planet Zeist and this is going to be a sci-fi story, it was painful, and I agree. 3.5 stars. The Renegade version of Highlander 2 is one of my favorite so bad it's good movies ever. Well, okay, if you want to take it like that, so bad it's good, bring a 6-pack or more, and yeah, maybe. 1 star. From the files of how did this get made, the Highlander was so good that I guess a sequel was called for, is perhaps the explanation for this film, but it's just so bad. From Sean Connery making a comeback, spoiler, he was killed in the first film, to the unnecessary dystopian future, to the terrible acting from the main lead, it's pretty much unwatchable. I watched it simply to refresh myself as to how bad this film was, to get ready for a HD TGM podcast, and I'm glad I did. Okay, so maybe somewhere out there in podcast world, people are still talking about Highlander. Now, I think it could make a comeback. It could certainly make a comeback, appealing to the original fans, appealing to myself. We're not too old to get into it again, but you'd have to appeal to the new people, or it's not going to work. And you would have to disavow sci fi elements. You would have to disavow everything but the first Highlander movie, and you better get it right the first time because you don't want to go down another Terminator road because we don't need 12 more sequels, each one just striving to remake the original. Um, how did it get made? Yeah, I agree with this review. The first one just had such a cultural hit that it was begging to be done again. Now, the problem with this is money-wise, it wasn't a hit, the first movie, but it just hit the right cultural chords. Everybody my age, everywhere I went, had a copy of this on VHS and had no problem watching it 4 or 5 times and watching it again after that. Um, it just struck everybody the right way. It's hard to put my finger on it, but I would say it had the edge of, the Queen rock music. It had a drama and a love story. It had a villain that was over the top and cartoony and comic booky, but still serious. It had a refreshing visual style, and I think that was a big part of it, the way the flashbacks melded with the current storyline in the first movie, and it kind of just slid over into the other time period and slid back again at just the right part. The style, the way it was told, it was a comic book type movie before comic book movies were a thing. I believe a comic was made about it. I'm not going to get into that. Um, 2 stars. While the prequel part was interesting at first, the cartoonish villains and Highlander being part of Ramirez's past ruins it, combined with a boring subplot and bad effects, and the result is a very cheesy, boring, direct-to-video style movie that somehow got a theatrical release. And again, they're touching upon something else I should have mentioned. One of the big reasons that it seemed like a big middle finger to Highlander fans was because in the original movie, a large part of the plot revolved around how the protagonist, Duncan MacLeod, met this Spanish character played by Sean Connery, whose name was Ramirez. Now, in the first movie, he met him along and had adventures with him in our past. Now, in the sequel movie, it's revealed that they knew each other before on planet Zeist, and they were part of this war between immortals on planet Zeist. There was no effort made how they suddenly forgot all about this and met each other for the first time in the first one. Again, this was just a big middle finger. It wasn't even attempted. You could try to say, maybe they had some kind of amnesia when they were brought to Earth, etc. But this wasn't even there wasn't even an attempt to explain how this could have happened. It was just thrown out there like, oh, didn't you know they knew each other on this other planet? This is completely insane. And they're touching on it here. Ramirez's past, and Ramirez in the first movie told the main character in the course of meeting him, his backstory, how he had learned he was immortal and the adventures he had had. And in the second movie, it just kind of throws it all out the window and says they all knew each other on planet Zeist and met again on Earth. This is complete insanity. It was the middle finger to all of us. 4 stars. Not as epic as the first, but I really enjoyed it. I don't believe you. I don't believe this review, the 4 stars, or that you really enjoyed it. I can't agree with 1 syllable of that. 1 star. Makes me wonder what actually happened here. It is gloriously terrible. Yeah, I wonder too what happened. Again, this is before the internet took off and we had online movie reviews, and we had access to all this behind the scenes stuff at the touch of our fingers. I've never heard a story on what happened. I've only heard stories about how people have tried to fix it. It's a complete disconnect from the story, the second movie. It's still a mystery to me how it happened. 4 stars, Spanish, but I'm probably going to disagree with them in any case. 2 stars. Someone had 1,000 ideas at once and didn't know what he was doing with any of them when he created this vividly dark, yet enthralling and weird sequel. A few moments of brilliance surrounded by tons of campiness. I disagree with this. I don't think whoever did this even saw the first movie, perhaps. I mean, that's one theory of mine. He just figured he needed to do something crazy because it was a comic book type story, and maybe he looked at what happened in the first movie after he had shot half of this one and said, oh well, shrugged his shoulders and kept going. I mean, I just can't imagine how he had 1,000 ideas at once and didn't know what to do with any of them. No, there were only a few ideas in this movie, and that was that he needed the protagonist to be a scientist and to be fighting the evil corporation that had taken over his energy shield, and that was it. That was the Highlander movie. It was a complete disconnect from the one that had gathered all of us fans. 4 stars. Not your average, more of the same sequel. Highlander 2 is an adventure in imagination. Fun, creative, like nothing you've seen. One of the best sequels, right up there with Empire Strikes Back, Godfather 2, and Terminator 2. Okay, now, this is just people bored and they're going online to type this stuff up because no, 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 no. 5 stars. Excellent film that accurately depicts the historical context of the early 90s when the ecological thought began to be triggered. Well, this does bring up one interesting thing. In the 90s, you did see more and more of a focus on, the green movement, so to speak. We're destroying the environment. We're all doomed because of it. It didn't really have that to it. This movie, the second one, it made more of, it was making more of a statement on corporate villains, how a corporation can take something of yours and make it into evil. That was what really came across more than like the ecological message. In this movie, humans on Earth had already destroyed the ozone layer, and the protagonist had fixed this, and then a corporation had taken over this fix and was using it for evil purposes. It was more of an anti-corporate message than an ecology message, so I don't agree with that. 3 stars. Jesus Christ. In the last scene of the movie, Lambert turns into a complete sword master and dishes out one hell of an ass-kicking to Michael Ironside. Well, Lambert, his character, Duncan MacLeod, was a complete sword master in the first movie, so what's the problem with that? Or are they saying that's a good thing? Maybe they are saying it's a good thing for the 3 stars. They're just judging it on the sword fighting. The sword fighting was nothing special. In fact, in the first Highlander movie, the sword fighting was nothing special. It was just the whole setting and the backstory of it that got us hooked. The sword fighting itself, even as a big Highlander fan, I never considered that like to be particularly fantastic. It was just okay. 3 stars. The Renegade version is one of those movies that's so bad it's good. It could be, again, I say bring lots of alcoholic beverages. 1/2 star. With all the questions answered from the first, the only question now is why make a sequel? Money, money, money. This post is from 2015. Again, many, many years after the Highlander, sequel of 91. Why make it money, money, money? I agree. But don't say the word now as though you're reviewing it in 1991. This post kind of comes across like they're reviewing it in 1991. Money, 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 I agree. But from the point of view of a Highlander fan, there's no excuse why this couldn't have succeeded. I mean, even if they had just continued with the first story and not made it a sci-fi show, anything would have probably been accepted by us fans because we wanted more material so badly. They just really they really screwed up with this. Half a star. Quite possibly the worst sequel ever made. Only watch the Renegade version. Well, I'll agree it is quite possibly the worst sequel ever made, at least for a number two. The Renegade version, what's the point? It's still just as bad. It just cuts out mention of the planet Zeist. It's still a completely disconnected sci-fi movie, and it's laughably bad. I disagree. Half a star, a complete turd. The filmmakers didn't understand their own project and they undermined their own past film. The film begins in the future where Connor the Highlander has helped some scientists create a shield to protect the Earth's ozone layer. Later on, the film states that all of the immortals who die on Earth go back to a planet called Zeist until they are killed on Zeist and return to Earth. What the hell? This plot point was created, I'm sure, as a reason to bring Sean Connery character back for the sequel. Okay, I had forgotten about that. That was the reason that Sean Connery could appear in the future. Yes, in the first movie, the idea was the immortals had been on Earth forever, and that over the centuries, they were slowly killing each other off by beheading until there would only be one, and the phrase goes, there can only be one. And then that one would get this mythical prize. That's all well and good. And then in the second movie, they said, well, after you're killed on Earth, you go back to planet Zeist. And then when you're killed on planet Zeist, you go back to Earth. So you're ping-ponging between two different realities or two different planets. Completely lunatic nonsense plot. A complete travesty. Half a star. Yeah, I've got nothing. I've got something, but maybe nothing would be better. Who knows? 1 star. Confusing and tedious. Confusing. Not so much confusing because they do coherently explain everything happening in the second movie, but it is a big WTF if you just watched the first one a few minutes earlier. I'll give you that. Half a star. Probably the biggest what the moment in science fiction cinema. If it doesn't tie with Battlefield Earth as being the worst sci-fi movie, it sure does rank just an inch below it. Again, I don't agree really, because when we compare Battlefield Earth to this, we're comparing sci-fi to something that's not supposed to be sci-fi. So I agree that Battlefield Earth is a sci-fi movie, fails horribly. But it fails for completely different reasons than this movie fails, because this movie is not supposed to be a sci-fi movie. That's the problem. This is supposed to be an action fantasy movie slash fantasy historical. This is not even supposed to be a sci-fi movie, so it's fail before it can even be failed as a sci-fi movie. Wow. So yeah, WTF, 2 stars. Not as good as the first movie. It contradicts the plot of the first movie, and the acting dropped off as well. The acting didn't really drop off. The scripting of the actors did. The acting didn't. The acting in the first one wasn't that fantastic. I think the reason that Christopher Lambert came off so well in the first one was because his style of acting, it actually fit with the character, and the recluse, introverted nature of the character in the first one. His style of acting just fit with it. Now, I think that's why Christopher Lambert faded away, because that style of acting, his acting isn't going to work in any other type of character. But in that first movie, it just hit. It hit the bullseye. It's like an archer that doesn't know what he's doing, but his first arrow off the bow just happened to hit the bullseye. Well, sometimes it happens. But as an actor, Lambert's performance wasn't any worse than the second one. It's just that in the first one, it hit the target. 5 stars. One of the prime examples of so bad it's good cinema. Awful in every way, but hugely entertaining thanks to overacting, crappy special effects, and crazy shit in every scene. Okay, if you're judging it on that, I again say get imbibed on something because otherwise this just isn't funny enough either. I mean, no, it takes substances to make this actually a comedy. 1 star. The first Highlander was a terrific action, fantasy, science fiction film. I disagree on the science fiction part. That was highly entertaining and delivered some impressive thrills, memorable action, and a great soundtrack. But this sequel fails to entertain, and it's a ridiculously poorly made film that just doesn't satisfy. This sequel has been said that it ranks among one of the worst films ever made. Well, I have seen far worse than this, but nonetheless, it's pretty bad. Whatever you've enjoyed about the original is ruined due to a lack of scripting, etc. I agree. Whatever you saw in the first one that was enjoyable, if you if you're lucky, somebody warns you from the second one before you watch it, because it's better to just go through the other bad ones. At least they follow along in the same genre and don't try to like change into something else. Skip this one for last just to make fun of it. That's my opinion. 2.5 stars. It creatively gets around the problem of the first movie's solid and definitive ending. I'll give it that. It makes little sense, but at least there was a little effort. Unlike the shoehorning in of superpowered guardian angel Ramirez, what? 0% on Rotten Tomatoes. This movie is horrifically awesome. Well, he does make a point. It does kind of get around the ending of the first one, because the ending of the first one, it is an ending like it's meant to be an ending. It didn't leave any room open to have a continuation, not whatsoever. And I think, again, the creators of the first one didn't have any clue that it would hit the cultural mark like it did and become popular. And it didn't initially at the theater. And then in the second one, somebody tried to figure out how to get around that finality of the first one, and they did a really bad, I mean, they were so desperate to get around it, apparently they switched it to a sci-fi movie. I think if somebody had spent enough time on it, they could have gotten around it, gotten around the problem of the first one's ending in a non-offensive manner. But the way they did it in the second one was completely offensive. 1 star. Imagine if Blade Runner had been directed by Ed Wood with its unbelievably bad dialogue, editing, tone. Highlander 2 is so awesome in its awfulness that it ends up being funny as hell. It deserves 1 star, but I'll secretly give it 3. Okay, again, maybe if you're drunk. 2 stars. I know this film has been cut and recut many times, but with the definitive version, it's quite an okay film. Is there a definitive version? I'm not quite certain. The scenario has massive loopholes, but still the look and design of the film are much better now and the story more entertaining and fun. It's almost a different film and not entirely a sequel. Having loved the first one, I can't pretend I'm not a bit disappointed with the sequel, but I still think it's far better than film 3, 4, and 5. Far from being a success, Renegade or Quickening is an interesting film. I think you're giving it way too much credit. I think you're way over giving credit to the the attempts to fix it with the Renegade cut and all this. No. There's nothing fun about this unless you're wasted. 0.5 star. People call it the worst sequel ever for a reason. Yes, they do. 2 stars. This was the most disappointing sequel I have ever seen. Changes the whole reason for the movie. Yeah, we're talking about a complete genre swap with no clue as to why. 3 stars. Audiences unfamiliar with the first film will be hard put to follow the action from a story by Brian Clements as it incoherently hops about in time and space. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to make sense of something when it swaps into a totally different genre with no warning. 1 star. Terrible turncoat abandons the clever plot of the original for grade Z nonsense. Don't hold this dud against the original. And that makes a good point. Don't look at Highlander 2 and think that's what Highlander's about. Don't let it stop you from watching the original. Certainly don't let it stop you from following the TV show, because I highly recommend it. Let's move on. 3.5 stars. Despite what people say, it doesn't make sense. It does not link up with the first one. The movie is too short, despite what I think it's ace, and I enjoy it every time I see it. I disagree. It should never have been made. Too short? No, it was probably about the right length to tell the story it was trying to tell. It doesn't make sense. You're right, it doesn't when you look at it from the perspective of the first one. It does make sense within its own story, though. As far as like the main character trying, the main character attempting to destroy what a corporation has made of his work, that makes sense. That's not the part that has the problem. The part with the problem is that it has nothing to do with the original movie. 0.5 star. Whether you're a Highlander fan or not, you'll hate this movie. The writing is the single biggest problem in the film. They are not aliens. The quickening is a completely different meaning. Ramirez's resurrection makes no sense. Connor turns old, then young again. Why is this in the 21st century, and what's with the ozone layer plot? So many inconsistencies and so many other flaws. They even made a new cut of the film a few years later to fix the mess of the theatrical version. It didn't help. Again, these points have been made before. They tried to fix it, but it isn't a question of, a couple of scenes in the movie make it bad. It's a question that the entire premise of it, period, is offensive to the first movie. 1 star, worst ever sequel, worse than Batman and Robin, worse than Superman 3 or 4. Agreed, agreed, and agreed. None of those sequels, Batman or Robin or any of the Superman films, as bad as they were not offensive to the first one. And they didn't try to genre swap. It would be like, a comparison would be like if you took the original Superman, the movie, which even today holds up well and everybody loves it, and then you got to Superman 2, and Superman 2, Superman was a cowboy in the Old West and just had vague memories of being Superman, and it was explained that after he was exposed to kryptonite, he was transported back in time to the Old West and became like a gunslinger. This would be completely insane, and that's what happened with Highlander 2. 1.5 stars. Take all the corniness of the first film and give it a hefty dose of really bad sci-fi. Add a splash of comic relief because people are going to be laughing at your movie regardless. The result is Highlander 2. No, I saw this film more than once, unfortunately, and no, I suspect that whoever made this movie, everyone involved in it, that they took it seriously. They didn't know it was going to be laughed at. There's no hint that they were making fun of themselves. If they had, it would have been actually something more enjoyable. But no, they came at this 100% serious and somehow expected fans of the first one to take it serious. And that's why we became so offended. 2.5 stars. I never liked this one as much as the first. If they hadn't completely destroyed the whole backstory from the first movie and just made up some random sci-fi bit in this one, it could have been so much better. Yeah, that's putting it mildly, but still 2.5 stars. No, take that back to 1 star. 2 stars. The worst of the Highlander movies, although there are some funny scenes, 7 lines in it. Rumor had it that it actually more accurately reflected the novel the series was based on. That's the first I've heard that this was based on any novel. Maybe there's a graphic novel or comic book work out there that precedes it. It's highly doubtful that that's relevant, even so, because I've met all types of Highlander fans and none of them refer to any novel. They all refer to being enthralled with the first movie. So even if there is material out there this is based on, I would say I'm going to judge it as completely irrelevant. 5 stars. Loved this movie as an 8-year-old in 1991. Still love it now. No, I'd say you have to still be 8 years old to still love this movie. I'm sorry, but that's the way I see it. 2.5 stars. I would have preferred the sci-fi part without the Highlander, or the Highlander without the sci-fi part. Yeah, exactly, because this is mixing two genres that weren't supposed to be together under the Highlander banner. I liked the background story about life under the shield more than the actual Highlander story. It seems the producers had so many ideas about what they wanted to do with this movie that they wound up failing to implement any of them properly. It's not as bad as some critics say, though it is definitely bad. Also, it's worth mentioning that this movie has been edited and re-released. No, I'd say it's as bad as they say, even worse, and it's offensive. It's not just bad, it's offensive to fans of the original, to fans of the movies that and the TV show that came afterward, and it's still offensive. 4 stars. This movie just did not go along with any other movie in this saga. It is an excellent movie, and as a standalone, it is great. But the whole alien thing just doesn't fit with the rest of the movie. Well, no, not alien thing, but sci-fi thing. If they had put aliens in it, that's the only thing that probably would have made this worse. The only thing. Just put, some kind of alien plot in it. Fantastic. Wow. 2 stars. Opposed by a ruthless corporation, an immortal investigates whether it's time to remove the ozone shield he suggested blanketing around the Earth, all while he's being hunted by another immortal, either an alien or a visitor from the past, depending on which version you see, bent on unmotivated revenge. Understandably, this nonsensical, incompetent sci-fi action comedy that changed all the rules and brought back Sean Connery from the dead was an insult to fans. Agreed. And I guess, okay, referring to the alien plot, I guess you could consider all of the Immortals aliens if you were to take seriously the idea that they're from the planet Zeist. Again, I don't, so that's why when I say aliens, I mean if they had put like gray aliens from, a Steven Spielberg movie in it, then that's what I mean by putting aliens in it. I don't consider the Immortals to be aliens. So let's move on. 0.5 star. One of the most incomprehensible movies ever made. Even die-hard fans of the Highlander series will be hard-pressed to find anything redeeming about this one. I agree. Especially when you say die-hard fans of the Highlander series, they find this offensive, not just hard-pressed to find something redeeming. It actually offends us. 0.5 star. 0% rating. Yes, that's very fair. 0.5 star. This movie just sucked. 4 stars. There is apparently an unwritten rule that if a sequel deviates at all from what made the original popular/successful, then it is the bastard son of celluloid and should be shunned as such. Personally, I admire sequels that go out on a limb and try a new situation with familiar characters. This movie rules firstly because of its sheer abandon of logic. Not that the first had any, and secondly, just because it is just goddamn fun. Loved it, and no dour-faced McLeod wannabe can convince me otherwise. Wow. Okay, well, at least you're boldly stating what you believe. I believe you're sincere. You must also be a fan of Star Wars The Last Jedi, and of apparently what's going to be space horses running on Star Destroyers in Star Wars The Rise of Skywalker, because you just like new stuff thrown in, even if it doesn't match the genre, even if it's completely nonsensical to the logic of what came before. So more power to you, but that's not what most people expect in their movie. 0.5 star. Simply the worst movie I have ever seen. It's worth watching just because of how monumentally horrible and laughable it is. Even for Highlander fans, it's just bad. Laced with bad special effects, horrible dialogue, and continuity errors, not to mention the script throws out everything you're told from the first movie. Still not convinced? All other Highlander material ignores this movie as if it never happened. Nuff said. Yeah, I believe that's on the point. Every other piece of Highlander fiction ignores this one. It never happened, and there's a reason for that. That's the reason I say skip this. 0.5 star. Wish this was the worst Highlander movie ever made. I really do. So you're saying the others were worse. I disagree. Even what's considered the worst one, maybe Endgame, That is because it pays more attention to the TV show than the original character. But if you're just judging this based on, judging which Highlander movie is the worst based on what's going on in the movie, Highlander 2 is the worst. The acting and whatnot is not worse than the other ones. This one is the big middle finger to the fans. I don't know how you would consider this not the worst one. I completely disagree. 5 stars. The Renegade version is the definitive version. If anyone says Planet Zeist, punch them in the throat. As a sci-fi action film, this film is amazing. As a Highlander film, what? No, I disagree. As a sci-fi action film, this film is just like a 2.5. And that's if you stripped out everything related to Highlander and made it completely something else. It would be 2.5 stars. Not the worst, but certainly not good. Half a star. Russell McCaulley had one job when he made Highlander 2, The Quickening. Tell a story about ancient warriors with cool sword fights and let sleeping dragons rest. But he instead decided to destroy Highlander, the past of Highlander, and the future of Highlander. He destroyed his own creation. What he did to Highlander is worse than what God did to Jesus or what Abraham was about to do to Isaac. He had so many ideas and they were all horrible. They destroyed everything set up by Highlander. I'd say no, not so much that, but somebody, I don't know if it was this Russell Mulcahy or who it was, decided that they just wanted to make it a sci-fi genre movie, and to hell with what came before. That's how it comes across to me. Half a star. McLeod Ramirez. So not a fan. The characters were ruined just by virtue that they existed in the second one. It did ruin them. That's why I say don't watch the second one. Watch the whole TV series first, and then come back and laugh at this one. 2 stars. What on earth, Zeist, were they fucking thinking? Yeah, I haven't yet figured that out. Half a star. What the fuck? This is a piece of shit. Totally sucks. Hard to imagine what H2 The Quickening must have been worse. I saw the Renegade Edition. What a waste. Well, yeah, the Renegade Edition doesn't fix the problem, does it? 3.5 stars. It might not be as great as the first, but at least the DVD version makes it a bit more enjoyable. Along those lines, I would say maybe if you get this on BitTorrent, it's the most enjoyable because you didn't pay for it, assuming you don't have a data cap on your internet plan. 2.5 stars. The sequel to Highlander lives up to the franchise tagline that there can be only one. While not the complete travesty it's made out to be, this movie did more to hurt the series than it did to help it. Good point made there in that, you can use that famous line, there can be only one, in regards to the first Highlander movie, because nothing else has ever topped it. Nothing recaptured the spirit of it. You can say that the TV show did, but not really, because the TV show kind of takes it a little bit differently with a different character. The TV show in its own right is good, but as far as capturing the magic of the original, nothing ever has. I'm hoping that someday something will, but that might be, who knows, someday 20 years from now. 4 stars. Makes a fine addition to my collection. A collection of what exactly? Wow. Half a star. If the first Highlander movie was one of the best movies I've ever seen, this sequel had to be one of the worst. No words can do justice to how awful it is. This piece of garbage is unbelievably bad. As a former teacher, I give it an F. I agree. You don't even need to be a teacher to grade this an F. You might have to find new letters of the alphabet. 4 stars. After seeing the original version, I couldn't believe how cheap and god-awful this movie had, and I called the most unexcused movie that has ever been made. Okay, I'm going to stop right there. Why did you give this 4 stars? Why did you give this 4 stars when you're telling me this was cheap and god-awful? Go down to 1 star, and then I'll read the rest after you change it for me. Thank you. 3 stars. Better than the first. This movie was total action. I don't know what movie you're talking about. Maybe you hit the wrong page on your review. 3.5 stars. This review is specifically for the Renegade version, but I'm going to get hate for it anyway. I actually liked it. Okay. You're not going to get hate, but you're just going to get a lot of confusion. if you strike out the Highlander name from it and make it some other movie, it belongs in its own franchise and it has nothing to do with Highlander, then I could see 2.5 stars, but you've given it 3.5, so I disagree. 1 star. Successfully undermines the complete storyline of the original film by making the Immortals aliens sent to Earth from the planet Zeist. A poor decision. Not just a poor decision, it's like they didn't even watch more than a few minutes of the first one, whoever was responsible. 1 star. Takes the whole movie to begin and then resolves itself in the last 10 minutes. And oh yeah, it turns out Scottish people are actually aliens from the past. Well, I agree on the 1 star, and I agree on the gist of what you're saying. 2.5 stars. Doesn't work as a sequel, but it does have some interesting scenes. Well, it is interesting. Like, again, I say, if it was just a standalone sci-fi movie, it's interesting with the shield angle and all that. I think that could have been made into an interesting movie, especially with Michael Ironsides at the time. But as a Highlander film, also you would have to get rid of Christopher Lambert because he was great in the Highlander, but in a generic sci-fi movie he wouldn't have worked, and he didn't. So if you had made it just a Michael Ironside vehicle, maybe even had it as a Schwarzenegger film and had a better script, it could have worked. Sure, it could have been nice. 1.5 stars. Why couldn't they just stop at 1? Well, the first one was too good. Nobody wanted them to stop at 1. I didn't want them to stop at 1. After I had seen the first one 12 times, I had hopes that there would be more, and it just insulted us all. 0.5 star. Can I give it 0 stars? I saw this in its initial release way back when. I walked out on it and never looked back. I don't remember much about it now, except it was terrible. Just plain bad. Avoid this movie at all costs like the plague. Yeah, I don't remember it when it was released in the theater. I only saw it when it came out on cable or satellite. And I'm glad I had been too busy to catch it in the theater because I would have been pissed off. I mean, more so than, people that walked out of, Phantom Menace or The Last Jedi. I would have been pissed off. 3 stars. Glorious 90s dystopian future cheese. If you take out all the Highlander stuff, it could have maybe gotten to 3 stars. Maybe. 0.5 star. Holy crap, this was bad. I guess I knew that already, but gave the first 15 minutes a rewatch recently. Wow. Up there with the worst movies of all time. Shame. I always liked the first movie. Yeah, it's a shame. 4 stars. Very good, this movie. Thanks to this film and the first. Also thanks to the Anaheim film. I wasn't aware there was an Anaheim film. I'm probably not going to put myself through that. I'm not a fan of Anaheim to begin with. Very good, this movie, huh? Wow. I don't know. If you're in another country where a lot of things are considered good that Americans can't stomach, then maybe you're right. I don't know. 1 star. There's a little pleasure in seeing Lambert, Connery, and all the Immortals mythology again, but The Quickening is a huge mistake, an incredible mess that just proves how far Hollywood can go to make an unnecessary sequel, almost spectacular in its own awfulness. I agree, except again, a sequel was necessary. We were demanding a sequel, but we just weren't demanding this garbage. So I think sequels were necessary, and that's borne out by the TV show. If there wasn't a desire to see more mythology along the lines of Highlander, then why did the TV show run for 6 years? It ran for 6 years because it was popular, and at the time there were comics and there were catalogs that you can order. You could order Highlander merchandise. That was a thing. I wasn't into that, but there were a lot of people into that stuff. There was a huge desire for more Highlander material. It was completely necessary to have another one. It wasn't necessarily to insult everybody with it. 3 stars, second only to the first. Wrong. 3 stars. Honestly, the 3 stars goes to the Renegade version. Wrong. I'm not even going to get into it. The Renegade version doesn't fix the problem. excuse me, it wasn't just Zeist that the problem comes from. The problem is that it's not a sci-fi genre movie, The Highlander, so it doesn't belong in Highlander, period. Um, half a star, oh crap, this is terrible. 1 star, one of the worst sequels, not to mention films ever made. Sean Connery's character brings along some good laughs, but that doesn't compensate for the terrible plot that negates the entire first film and brings in a ridiculous alien subplot. Okay, well, this reminds me of one thing that could be laughable nowadays with Highlander 2. There's a scene where Sean Connery's Ramirez character and Duncan McLeod, or excuse me, Connor McLeod, they break into this Shield Corp headquarters by just rolling through the front security gate in an old car, and they are lit up by machine gun fire in which their bodies are just riddled with bullets. I mean, riddled like, animated corpses dancing to all the bullets riddling their bodies. And this was supposed to be cool and edgy in the movie, but if you're just half through your first beer, you'll probably laugh hysterically because the way Ramirez's body jumps around in the front seat, it is quite funny to watch. But half a beer more needed, of course. Um, 2 stars, a horribly disappointing sequel to the original Highlander, which rocked, muddied by a ridiculous attempt to explain the Immortals' origin as ETs and a preposterous plotline. It fails on every level. While Lambert and Connery are both back, it feels like they are largely going through the motions. The original chemistry is gone. About the only thing going for it are the awesomely over-the-top Michael Ironside and the always beautiful and talented Virginia Madsen. Otherwise, this one is a stinker. He brings up one point. It had all good actors. All these actors are highly acclaimed in other things. They didn't have bad chemistry together. It's just that this whole thing was an insult from the word Planet Zeist. Really bad. 4 stars. Script was not as good as the first. Always very confusing when the last movie is the series. Not sure what they're saying. Yeah, it's confusing if you watch the first one and then you bumped into this wreck and you're like, wow, wait a minute, sci-fi? What happened? I didn't switch it to the sci-fi channel. So, yeah. 5 stars. Best movie I've ever seen. Right, sure it was. Half a star. I still don't get this one. Neither do I. 3 stars. It went from there. Can only be one to a sequel, and that means there's 2. So can there really only be 1? No, actually, there's actually 5, maybe more. But we needed more than 1. 1 star. To say that this film is so bad it's good is a gross understatement. It's more like it's so terrible it's awesome. This movie defies explanation. It's an experience that has to be seen to be understood. Fans of the first film, stay away. People who want a terrible, incomprehensible, awesome flick, this one is for you. So, okay, I agree. Like I said, get into your 4th or 5th beer and then slide into this one. Just don't think it's a Highlander movie. 3 stars. This is where the series began to go downhill. After this, the rest was crap. No, this is the big, huge speed bump. Don't think everything else is downhill. Believe it or not, the third one, in my opinion as a fan, is actually better than this. And that's not saying much. 1.5 stars. This film is an historically masterful mess, and for good reason. Not only did this sequel completely dash all hopes of this series, butting into a decent franchise, it also makes absolutely no sense when viewed on its own merits. Several interesting and, dare I say it, clever storylines are tossed around, but nothing is ever made of them. These ideas are put straight into a blender of nonsensical writing and ground up until the final product feels nothing like its far superior predecessor. I agree with all of that. But I disagree that it derailed having a successful franchise, because it certainly didn't. Highlander went on to become very popular, particularly in the TV show. I'm hazarding to guess that fans of the TV show could completely ignore every movie except the first and still have an enjoyable time, and that's what I recommend people do. So I'm going to wrap this one up. I'm calling it Rotten Reviews of Highlander 2: The Quickening, but But you could take it as rotten reviews of Highlander, all of the sequels, if you'd like. I think that's fair. And on that note, I'm wrapping this up. I will see you on the next one.